Sirens screamed, red and blue lights painted the manicured lawns, and I pointed a trembling finger at Mrs. Henderson's backyard. She did it. I yelled, my voice cracking, that HOA Karen stole my baby goat for a barbecue. You have to shut it all down. The officers looked confused, their gaze shifting from my distraught face to the bewildered group of neighbors gathered for what was supposed to be a lovely community cookout. How had it come to this? Just hours ago, my little Daisy, a fluffy white ball of bleeding joy, was frolicking in her pen. Now, the unmistakable scent of roasting meat wafted from Mrs. Henderson's grill, and my heart hammered with a terrible suspicion. The world seemed to spin, leaving me to wonder what horrors I was about to uncover. Life in the Sunnyside Estates HOA was usually as tranquil as a Sunday afternoon nap. Green lawns stretched out like emerald carpets, and the houses, all painted in approved shades of beige and gray, stood in neat rows. I, Sarah Miller, had moved here a year ago, seeking a quiet place to raise my 2 kids, Lily and Tom. They were energetic little whirlwinds, full of laughter and boundless curiosity. We had a modest home, a cozy 3-bedroom with a decent-sized backyard, perfect for a garden and, as it turned out, a small, very special addition to our family. It all started when Lily, my youngest, brought home a drawing from school. It was a rather lopsided depiction of a farm, complete with chickens, cows, and a tiny, smiling goat. "Mommy," she'd said, her eyes wide with a plea only a child can muster, "can we please get a goat? Just a little one?" Tom, ever the practical older brother, chimed in, "Yeah, Mom. It'll eat the weeds. And we can have fresh milk." I laughed it off at first. A goat? In Sunnyside Estates? The HOA would have a fit. Mrs. Henderson, our formidable HOA president, ruled with an iron fist and an even stricter rulebook. Her favorite phrase, often delivered with a stern look over her spectacles, was, "Maintaining community standards is paramount, dear." A goat, I was sure, did not fall under community standards. However, the idea, once planted, began to sprout. Lily and Tom didn't let up. They researched miniature goats, presented me with persuasive arguments about their benefits. Apparently, they were excellent emotional support animals, and even promised to do extra chores. Their enthusiasm was infectious. I started to waver. Maybe, just maybe, a tiny, well-behaved goat wouldn't be an issue. After all, the rules were vague on livestock, focusing more on lawn height and fence colors. One sunny Saturday, armed with a carefully crafted letter and a plate of my famous chocolate chip cookies, I approached Mrs. Henderson's pristine front door. She answered, her perfectly coiffed silver hair unmoving in the breeze. "Sarah, dear. To what do I owe this surprise?" she asked, a hint of suspicion in her tone. I smiled, offered the cookies, and launched into my practice speech about the educational benefits for the children, the quiet nature of miniature goats, and my solemn promise to keep the pen spotless. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on the cookies. She took one, bit into it thoughtfully, and then, to my utter astonishment, a slow smile spread across her face. "Well, Sarah," she said, crumbs dusting her chin, "as long as it's miniature, quiet, and doesn't disrupt the aesthetic of the neighborhood, I suppose we can make an exception. But one peep of trouble, and it's gone. Understood?" I practically skipped home, elated. My kids were going to be thrilled. A week later, Daisy arrived. She was a tiny, fuzzy creature with soft brown eyes and a mischievous spirit. Lily and Tom were instantly smitten. Daisy quickly became the unofficial mascot of our cul-de-sac. Kids from around the neighborhood would gather at our fence, giggling as Daisy nibbled clover or playfully head-butted Tom's shin. She had a gentle nature, and even Mrs. Henderson, initially stiff and wary, would occasionally stop by, offering Daisy a carrot stick and a rare, almost smile. We built a sturdy, clean pen for her, far from the property line, and made sure her presence was never a nuisance. Daisy brought a new kind of joy to our little corner of Sunnyside Estates, a warmth that seemed to melt away some of the neighborhood's rigid formality. The spring community barbecue was always the highlight of the year. This year, Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself, planning a grand affair with lawn games, a bouncy castle for the kids, and, of course, a massive grill. As I prepped my famous potato salad, the kids were outside, playing with Daisy. "Mommy," Lily called out, her voice bright with excitement. Daisy found a new patch of yummy grass. I smiled, imagining Daisy happily munching away. The afternoon was shaping up to be perfect. The air was filled with the scent of grilling burgers, cheerful chatter, and children's laughter. Then, a sudden, chilling quiet descended. Lily's excited shouts turned into panicked cries. "Daisy! Where's Daisy?" Tom joined in, his voice rising in alarm. I rushed outside, my heart seizing. The gate to Daisy's pen, which I had securely latched just hours before, was wide open. And Daisy was gone. My stomach dropped. I called her name, then the kids joined in, their voices becoming increasingly desperate. We searched everywhere, under bushes, behind sheds, even peering into the storm drains. No Daisy. The laughter and chatter from the barbecue now seemed like a cruel mockery. Panic started to set in, a cold, hard knot in my chest. Who would take a baby goat? And why? As the grilling odors intensified, a horrifying thought, absurd and sickening, began to take root in my mind. It was impossible, wasn't it? But as I walked towards the rising smoke and the sound of sizzling meat from Mrs. Henderson's backyard, a terrible dread washed over me, a feeling that something truly monstrous had happened. My footsteps felt heavy, each one dragging me closer to the source of the tantalizing, yet terrifying, aroma. The scent of roasted meat, once inviting, now filled me with a creeping horror. Lily and Tom, their faces streaked with tears, clung to my legs. "Mommy, what's that smell?" Lily whispered, her small voice trembling. I couldn't bring myself to answer. We rounded the corner of Mrs. Henderson's perfectly manicured hedge, and the scene before us was a picture of suburban bliss, shattered by my own mounting dread. Neighbors chatted, laughing, plates piled high with what looked suspiciously like something roasting on a spit over a glowing bed of coals. And right there, overseeing it all with a triumphant smile, was Mrs. Henderson, a long fork in hand, turning the skewered meat. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. It simply could not be. The morning had begun with such promise. The Sunnyside Estates' annual spring cleanup day was always a big event, and this year, I was determined to contribute more than just a polite wave from my porch. After the excitement of Daisy's arrival, I felt a renewed sense of community spirit. It wasn't just about my kids having a pet, it was about integrating into this neighborhood, making it truly feel like home. Lily and Tom were surprisingly enthusiastic, armed with small gardening gloves and mini rakes, ready to tackle any stray leaf or rogue twig. We met up with Mr. Jenkins, a kind, elderly gentleman who lived across the street. He was a retired history teacher with a twinkle in his eye and an endless supply of interesting stories. He'd often stop by to admire Daisy, sharing tales of his own childhood on a farm. "That little goat brings such life to the place, Sarah," he'd said just yesterday, patting Daisy's head. A refreshing change from all this uniformity. His words echoed in my mind as we joined the small group gathered to clear the common green space near the community center. Mrs. Henderson was, of course, directing operations. She stood with a clipboard, meticulously assigning tasks, her voice clear and authoritative. "Mr. Peterson, you're on rose bush pruning. Mrs. Rodriguez, the flower beds need weeding. Sarah, if you and the children could assist with collecting fallen branches near the oak trees, that would be most helpful." She gave me a rare, almost approving nod. I nodded back, grateful for the sense of normalcy. As we worked, the sun warmed our backs, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. Lily and Tom, giggling, discovered a surprisingly large worm, which they promptly named Wiggles, and then released back into the soil with a solemn promise of freedom. Even I found myself relaxing, enjoying the simple rhythm of work and the easy chatter among neighbors. We talked about upcoming summer plans, shared tips for keeping squirrels out of bird feeders, and even debated the best way to compost kitchen scraps. It felt genuinely pleasant, a far cry from the usual stiff formality that sometimes permeated HOA gatherings. Later that afternoon, after a productive morning of weeding, raking, and general tidying, the neighborhood began to prepare for the much-anticipated community barbecue. The air filled with the scent of charcoal starting up, and the distant sounds of children's excited shouts floated on the breeze. I headed home, tired but content, looking forward to a relaxed evening with friends and neighbors. Daisy, as always, was a comforting presence, munching contentedly on some fresh clover I'd brought her. I made sure her pen was secure, double-checking the latch, a habit I'd developed since her arrival. As the afternoon wore on, my kitchen filled with the aroma of potato salad and lemonade. The kids were buzzing with excitement, talking about the bouncy castle and the giant Jenga game they'd seen being set up. "Can Daisy come to the barbecue, Mom?" Lily asked, her hopeful eyes gazing up at me. I sighed. "Not this time, sweetie. It'll be too crowded, and she might get scared. We'll have lots of playtime with her tomorrow." She pouted but accepted it. Just before we left for the barbecue, I popped my head out to the backyard one last time to check on Daisy. She was curled up, fast asleep in her favorite sunny spot. I smiled, feeling a surge of affection for the tiny creature who had brought so much joy into our lives. The barbecue was in full swing when we arrived. Music played softly from outdoor speakers, children shrieked with delight in the bouncy castle, and a line had already formed at the grill where Mr. Davis, a jovial man known for his perfectly flipped burgers, was busy at work. Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly, was not at the main grill. She was tending to a smaller, more private grilling area near her patio, surrounded by a select group of her closest HOA committee members. I noticed a large, covered platter on her table, and a faint, unusual aroma wafted from her direction. It was a smell I couldn't quite place, but it was distinct from the typical burger and hot dog scent permeating the air. Lily tugged on my shirt. "Mommy, I want to go see Daisy." My heart dropped. "Honey, remember? Daisy's at home." She started to whimper, and then Tom, ever observant, said, "Mom, the gate's open." My head snapped towards our house. "What are you talking about, Tom?" He pointed, his little finger wavering towards our backyard. From this distance, it was hard to tell, but a cold dread began to creep up my spine. We excused ourselves from the barbecue, rushing back to our yard. The sight of the unlatched gate sent a jolt of pure panic through me. Daisy was gone. My mind raced. Had she wandered off? Unlikely, she never left the yard. Had someone taken her? But who, and why? The sickeningly sweet, unfamiliar scent from Mrs. Henderson's grill suddenly intensified in my memory. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was impossible. Mrs. Henderson, the stickler for rules, the woman who had reluctantly agreed to Daisy's presence, couldn't possibly be involved. Yet, an icy fear gripped me. As I stood there, reeling from the realization that Daisy was truly missing, I noticed a small, white tuft of fur clinging to a thorny rose bush near Mrs. Henderson's fence. It was unmistakably Daisy's. My blood ran cold. The unusual aroma, the open gate, the missing goat, and now this tuft of fur. It all pointed to one unbelievable, horrifying conclusion. My eyes locked onto Mrs. Henderson's private grilling area, and a primal scream of rage and grief built in my throat. I had to know, and the answer, I feared, was sizzling on that grill. A wave of nausea washed over me, a sickening mix of disbelief and burgeoning fury. My sweet Daisy, a beloved member of our family, reduced to this? It was an unthinkable act. My gaze darted from the small, telling tuft of white fur to the glistening, browning meat on Mrs. Henderson's grill. The jovial atmosphere of the barbecue faded into a dissonant hum in my ears. Everything became a blur except for that grill, that woman, and the horrifying realization that was dawning on me. Lily and Tom, sensing my distress, began to cry again, their innocent tears only fueling my growing rage. I clenched my fists, a silent scream building in my chest. Mrs. Henderson, still smiling, turned the spit, the flames licking hungrily at her horrific feast. My mind raced, grappling with the sheer audacity, the cold-hearted cruelty of it all. This was beyond a simple HOA violation, this was a crime, a personal betrayal that struck at the very core of our family. The initial days after Daisy's arrival were filled with pure delight. Lily and Tom were inseparable from her, spending hours in the backyard, reading her stories, and even attempting to teach her tricks, mostly unsuccessful, but endearing nonetheless. Daisy, for her part, thrived. She quickly grew from a wobbly-legged furball into a confident, curious little goat, her bleats becoming a familiar and comforting sound in our yard. We meticulously followed all the conditions Mrs. Henderson had laid out. Her pen was cleaned daily, her diet carefully monitored, and her gentle nature meant she rarely made much noise. Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Albright, a sweet, elderly lady who baked the best lemon squares in the neighborhood, became particularly fond of Daisy. She often brought over scraps of organic vegetables from her garden, lettuce leaves, carrot tops, and would spend a good half-hour simply watching Daisy munch. "She's good for the soul," that one, Mrs. Albright would coo, a soft smile on her wrinkled face. "Brings a bit of life to this place, doesn't she?" Her sentiment echoed my own. Daisy had undeniably added a layer of warmth and joy to our lives, something I hadn't realized was missing until she arrived. However, not everyone shared Mrs. Albright's enthusiasm. There was Mr. Peterson, a perpetually grumpy man who lived 2 houses down. He was a staunch traditionalist, obsessed with the pristine nature of Sunnyside estates. He complained about everything, my children's laughter being too loud, the color of my mailbox, it was a perfectly standard dark green, and now, the presence of a goat. He never said anything directly to me, but I'd often see him peering over his fence, a scowl etched on his face, whenever Daisy was particularly playful. I tried to ignore him, reminding myself that Mrs. Henderson, the ultimate authority, had given her reluctant approval. One afternoon, I was weeding my flower bed when I overheard a snippet of conversation between Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Peterson. They were standing near his fence, just out of direct earshot, but their voices carried on the breeze. "It's simply not appropriate, Eleanor," Mr. Peterson grumbled, his voice low but agitated. "A farm animal. In our community. What will people think?" Mrs. Henderson's reply was clipped. "I've handled it, Robert. There was an exception made. It's a miniature goat, well contained. And frankly, the children adore it." There was a pause, and then Mr. Peterson said something about slippery slopes and maintaining property values. Mrs. Henderson responded with a sigh, "Just leave it to me, Robert." The conversation ended there, and they both walked away. I dismissed it as typical Mr. Peterson grumbling, reassured by Mrs. Henderson's seemingly firm stance. A few weeks later, something unsettling happened. I woke up one morning to find Daisy's water bowl overturned and her small pile of hay scattered far outside her pen, almost as if someone had deliberately tossed it around. The latch on her gate was still secure, but it was clear someone had been in the yard. I checked the perimeter fence, but there were no obvious signs of forced entry. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a curious cat? Or a raccoon? I cleaned up the mess, reinforced the gate, and tried to put it out of my mind. Then, about a week before the barbecue, another incident occurred. I was inside, making lunch, when I heard Daisy let out a series of unusually frantic bleats. I rushed outside, expecting to find Lily and Tom playing a little too boisterously with her. Instead, I saw a fleeting shadow darting away from our fence, disappearing behind Mr. Peterson's shed. Daisy was agitated, stamping her tiny hooves and shaking her head. I checked her over, but she seemed unharmed. Still, the image of that fleeting shadow bothered me. It was too large to be a cat, too quick to be a stray dog. A chill ran down my spine. Was someone deliberately trying to upset Daisy? Or worse, was someone trying to scare us into getting rid of her? I thought back to Mr. Peterson's grumbling, to his disdain for anything that disrupted his idea of community standards. Could he be involved? It seemed far-fetched, almost cartoonishly villainous. Yet, the unease lingered. I decided to install a small, motion-activated camera near Daisy's pen, just for peace of mind. I didn't tell anyone about the incidents, not wanting to cause unnecessary alarm. I just wanted to protect Daisy. Now, standing here, watching Mrs. Henderson turn that spit, the pieces of the puzzle began to violently click into place. The missing hay, the overturned water, the fleeting shadow, Mr. Peterson's complaints, and Mrs. Henderson's seemingly calm but firm dismissal. Was it a coordinated effort? Did Mrs. Henderson, under the guise of HOA authority, decide to take matters into her own hands after pressure from disgruntled neighbors? The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots between the subtle acts of harassment and this unthinkable act of cruelty. My suspicion solidified into a chilling certainty. This wasn't just a lost pet. This was a deliberate act, and the mastermind was standing right in front of me, serving up what I now knew was my beloved Daisy. A cold, hard resolve settled over me. I wasn't just grieving, I was furious, and I was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of monster resided in Sunnyside Estates. Rage, pure and unadulterated, surged through me, eclipsing the initial shock. My eyes, burning with unshed tears and fury, fixated on Mrs. Henderson. She was still smiling, oblivious to the storm brewing within me, as she offered a piece of the roasted meat to a neighbor. "Just try a bit, dear," she chirped, "it's surprisingly tender." The words hit me like a physical blow. Tender. My baby Daisy. My vision blurred for a moment, and I had to clench my jaw to keep from screaming. Lily and Tom, sensing the shift in my demeanor, huddled closer, their small faces pale with fear. The lively sounds of the barbecue now felt like a taunt, the cheerful chatter a cruel symphony. My mind, usually calm and rational, was a whirlwind of accusations and disbelief. How could she? How could anyone do something so heinous, so utterly devoid of empathy? The thought of confronting her directly, right here, right now, was tempting, but a sliver of rationality, a desperate need for proof, held me back. I needed more than a gut feeling, however strong. I needed irrefutable evidence to expose this monstrous act to the entire community. The Sunnyside Estates HOA meetings were legendary for their meticulous adherence to procedure and, occasionally, for their bafflingly trivial debates. Mrs. Henderson presided over them with the solemnity of a Supreme Court justice. Each month, neighbors would gather in the community center, armed with grievances about overgrown hedges, misplaced recycling bins, or the dreaded, unapproved, garden gnome. I usually attended out of a sense of civic duty, trying to keep a low profile and avoid getting drawn into the petty squabbles. One particular meeting, about a month after Daisy had settled in, proved to be more eventful than usual. The topic was pet regulations and nuisance animals. My stomach clenched immediately. I knew this was aimed at Daisy. Mrs. Henderson opened the floor, her voice as smooth as polished marble. "Neighbors, we've had a few concerns raised recently regarding the presence of certain animals within our community. While we strive for a welcoming environment, we must also uphold the standards of Sunnyside Estates. Her eyes flickered towards me for a split second. Mr. Peterson, predictably, was the first to speak. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and launched into a tirade about undesirable livestock and the potential for property value depreciation. He spoke of strange odors, Daisy was meticulously clean, I assure you, and unsettling sounds, Daisy barely bleated unless she was excited. Other residents, surprisingly, spoke up in my defense. Mrs. Albright, bless her heart, gently reminded everyone of Daisy's gentle nature and how much joy she brought to the children. Even Mr. Davis, the burger flipper, chuckled and said, "Come on, Robert, it's just a little goat. Harmless as a bunny." Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly, sided with the majority, declaring that as long as the animal remained miniature, quiet, and well-maintained, it fell within a gray area of the existing bylaws and would be allowed. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that common sense, and perhaps a touch of community spirit, had prevailed. However, the peace was short-lived. A few days after the meeting, I received a formal notice of violation from the HOA, personally delivered by Mrs. Henderson. My heart sank as I opened it. It wasn't about Daisy directly, but about a minor infraction regarding the height of my mailbox post, which was supposedly half an inch too tall. It was clearly a retaliatory measure, a petty act of harassment. I sighed, knowing it was an unwinnable battle. I hired a handyman and got it fixed, but the incident left a bitter taste. It was clear that Mrs. Henderson, despite her public pronouncements, harbored a resentment towards Daisy's presence. The subtle acts of harassment continued. Anonymous notes would appear in my mailbox, complaining about trivial things. A child's forgotten toy on the lawn, a bird feeder attracting unnecessary wildlife. Each note was written in the same precise, elegant script, and though unsigned, I knew their source. It was a war of attrition, designed to wear me down, to make me feel unwelcome. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the simple joys of life with my kids and our cheerful little goat. Then came the truly unnerving event, just a week before the barbecue. I had just put the kids to bed when I heard a distinct scraping sound from the backyard. I peered out the window, my heart pounding. The motion-activated camera I'd installed was too low to capture anything specific, but I saw a faint, moving shadow near Daisy's pen. It was too dark to make out details, but the shadow seemed to be attempting to tamper with the latch. I froze, my breath held captive in my lungs. Just as I was about to call out, the shadow abruptly pulled back and disappeared into the darkness between the houses. I rushed outside, flashlight in hand. Daisy was huddled in the corner of her pen, trembling. The latch, though still closed, looked slightly bent. Someone had definitely tried to open it. The next morning, I reviewed the camera footage. It was grainy, mostly just a dark blob moving in the corner of the frame, but it confirmed my suspicions. Someone had been trying to get into Daisy's pen. The image wasn't clear enough to identify a face, but the general shape and height of the person suggested an adult. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? Someone tried to open my goat's gate? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. And proving who it was would be impossible with such blurry footage. I decided to keep the camera recording, hoping to catch something clearer. I doubled down on securing Daisy's pen, adding an extra chain and padlock, making it virtually escape-proof. I also began to bring Daisy inside the garage at night, just to be extra safe. It was an inconvenience, but her safety was paramount. Now, standing at the barbecue, the pieces of this disturbing puzzle finally clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The mailbox incident, the anonymous notes, the attempted tampering with the gate, it was all part of a calculated campaign. And now, the ultimate, cruel culmination. My eyes narrowed at Mrs. Henderson. She hadn't just been annoyed, she had been determined. The image of the distorted metal on Daisy's latch flashed in my mind. It wasn't an attempted escape, it was an attempted abduction. And she had succeeded. The fury in my heart hardened into a cold, unwavering resolve. I wasn't just going to get Daisy back, I was going to expose Mrs. Henderson for the cruel, conniving Karen she truly was, and I would make sure everyone knew what she had done. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of grief and righteous anger. The scene at Mrs. Henderson's barbecue was a grotesque mockery of neighborly cheer. People were genuinely enjoying the food, oblivious to the horrific truth sizzling before them. Lily and Tom clung to me, their small hands clutching my dress, their quiet whimpers a stark contrast to the festive chatter around us. I needed to act, and fast. The police, though they seemed initially bewildered by my outburst, were now observing the scene with a growing sense of unease. Mrs. Henderson, still blissfully unaware, continued to serve, her smile unchanging, her eyes gleaming with what I now recognized as a chilling satisfaction. A knot tightened in my stomach. I had to expose her, not just for Daisy, but for every small act of kindness she had crushed under the weight of her HOA rulebook. This was bigger than just a goat, it was about exposing the true nature of the woman who controlled our community with an iron fist. The Sunnyside Estates community newsletter, The Beacon, was Mrs. Henderson's personal mouthpiece. It arrived monthly, crammed with announcements about Yard of the Month winners, reminders about trash pickup schedules, and stern warnings about unapproved alterations to homes. Every issue contained a lengthy, President's Message, where Mrs. Henderson expounded on her vision for the community, which invariably involved more rules and less individuality. I usually skimmed it, barely registering the content beyond the basic information. However, after the incidents with Daisy's pen and the anonymous notes, I started reading The Beacon with a new, critical eye. I noticed a subtle shift in tone, a growing emphasis on maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood and eliminating disruptive elements. One article, in particular, caught my attention. Titled, Ensuring Harmonious Living, The Importance of Appropriate Pet Ownership, it was a thinly veiled attack on my decision to have Daisy. It discussed the potential for unpleasant odors, noise pollution, and even disease transmission from non-traditional pets. It ended with a stark reminder that the HOA reserved the right to enforce all covenants and restrictions to protect the community's welfare. It was clear, Mrs. Henderson was escalating her campaign against Daisy. I tried to counter this insidious narrative in my own small ways. I started leaving out platters of homemade cookies for the mailman, the delivery drivers, and anyone who passed by, trying to foster a sense of genuine neighborliness that extended beyond rigid rules. I initiated a small, informal book club with a few other moms on the street, creating a space for connection and conversation that had nothing to do with HOA dictates. Daisy, of course, was always a silent ambassador, her cheerful bleats and gentle demeanor winning over more and more residents. I shared photos of her with the kids on our community social media page, showcasing her playful spirit and the joy she brought to Lily and Tom. Most comments were overwhelmingly positive, with many neighbors expressing their delight at having such a unique and charming addition to Sunnyside Estates. These small acts of defiance, of warmth, felt like a quiet rebellion against Mrs. Henderson's cold control. Then came the day of the spring barbecue. The morning was a flurry of activity at our house. Lily and Tom were practically bouncing off the walls, excited for the bouncy castle and the games. I finished up my potato salad, feeling a sense of peace. Daisy was happily munching hay in her pen, enjoying the sunshine. Just before we left, I went out to check on her one last time. Her pen was secure, the extra padlock I'd added gleaming in the sunlight. I gave her a final pat, "Be a good girl, Daisy. We'll be back soon." We arrived at the barbecue as the first wisps of smoke were rising from the main grill. The air was already alive with the buzz of excited chatter and the joyful squeals of children. I greeted Mrs. Albright, who was admiring a display of freshly picked hydrangeas. Mr. Davis was expertly flipping burgers, his apron smeared with charcoal. Everything felt perfectly normal, wonderfully mundane. That feeling lasted all of 10 minutes. It began with a subtle change in the aroma. Over the familiar scent of grilled beef and hot dogs, new, distinct smell began to emerge. It was savory, rich, and utterly unfamiliar in the context of a suburban barbecue. My nose wrinkled. "What's that smell?" I murmured to Mrs. Albright. She sniffed the air. I'm not sure, dear. Mrs. Henderson often tries exotic new recipes." My stomach gave an uneasy lurch. As the afternoon wore on, the new aroma grew stronger, drawing me, almost against my will, towards Mrs. Henderson's private grilling station. She was there, flanked by Mr. Peterson and a few other staunch HOA committee members, all of them looking rather pleased with themselves. A covered platter sat on her table, and the smell emanating from it was becoming increasingly specific. It was the smell of roasting lamb, or perhaps, goat. A cold wave of dread washed over me, replacing the warmth of the afternoon. I saw the small white tuft of fur clinging to the rose bush, and my blood ran cold. It was unmistakably Daisy's. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The missing goat, the unusual aroma, the secure pen, the subtle harassment, the attempts to tamper with the latch, and Mrs. Henderson's private, secluded grilling. It all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward, towards the center of the gathering, towards Mrs. Henderson's grill. The cheerful laughter and music now sounded distant, distorted. My vision narrowed, focusing only on the spinning meat, and the cruel, satisfied smile on Mrs. Henderson's face. My baby goat. My sweet, innocent Daisy. She was the disruptive element that Mrs. Henderson had eliminated. The injustice, the sheer malice of it, was too much to bear. And that's when I screamed. My voice, raw and filled with anguish, sliced through the festive air, bringing the entire barbecue to a stunned silence. "She stole my baby goat for a barbecue!" I shrieked, pointing at Mrs. Henderson. "You have to shut it all down." All eyes turned to me, then to Mrs. Henderson, and then, slowly, to the rotating spit over her grill. My accusation hung in the air, a devastating silence falling over the once lively barbecue. Every single head swiveled towards Mrs. Henderson's grill, then back to me, their faces a mix of confusion, shock, and dawning horror. The police officers, who had been observing with growing concern, now looked at the roasting meat with a new, professional gaze. Mrs. Henderson's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of bewildered indignation. "Sarah, what on earth are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice thin. But her eyes, though she tried to hide it, darted nervously towards the spit, confirming my worst fears. Lily and Tom's sobs intensified, their small bodies shaking against me. This was it. The moment of truth. I had to make them see. The initial confusion on the faces of the police officers quickly morphed into a more serious demeanor. Officer Miller, a tall, calm woman, stepped forward. "Ma'am, can you please explain exactly what's going on?" she asked, her voice even. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "That," I declared, pointing a trembling finger at the roasting animal, "is my baby goat, Daisy. Mrs. Henderson stole her and is cooking her for this barbecue." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs erupted, hushed whispers of disbelief and outrage. Mrs. Henderson, finding her voice, scoffed. "Preposterous. This is lamb, Sarah. Prime quality lamb I purchased from a specialty butcher. You're making a spectacle of yourself." She tried to laugh, but it came out as a strained, high-pitched sound. Mr. Peterson, ever her loyal sycophant, chimed in, "She's clearly distraught, officers. It's just a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," I cried, my voice gaining strength. "Daisy went missing from her pen just hours ago. I found her fur on your rose bush. And that smell, it's not lamb. It's goat. Officer Miller exchanged a look with her partner, Officer Jenkins. "Ma'am," Officer Jenkins said, addressing Mrs. Henderson, "would you mind if we took a closer look at the meat?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously. "This is highly irregular. You can't just inspect my private property." But her protest was weak, edged with panic. Officer Miller, without waiting for permission, approached the grill, her professional gaze sweeping over the roasting animal. She leaned in, sniffed, and then straightened up, her expression unreadable. "It's certainly not beef or pork," she stated, her voice flat. "And the size, it's quite small for a typical lamb roast." My heart pounded. This was my chance. Daisy was a miniature goat. I exclaimed. She was the size of a small dog. I pulled out my phone, quickly finding a picture of Daisy with Lily and Tom, a clear shot of her size and distinctive markings. "Look." I thrust the phone towards Officer Miller. She took it, comparing the image to the roasting animal. The silence was deafening as she studied both. Then, a voice broke through the tension. It was Mrs. Albright, her face pale. "My goodness," she whispered, stepping forward. "I've brought Daisy carrots. I know her markings. And that little patch of brown on her ear. Daisy had that. It looks just like it." Her words, soft but firm, carried weight. Mrs. Albright was universally respected, her honesty unquestioned. A wave of horrified recognition began to spread through the crowd. Neighbors began pointing, their faces showing dawning horror. "She's right," someone whispered. "It does look like that little goat." Mrs. Henderson's face drained of all color. "This is slander," she shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "This woman is insane." But her protests were drowned out by the growing clamor of the crowd. More people were now crowding around the grill, peering at the roasted animal, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place for them as well. The joyous barbecue atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by a chilling realization. Officer Miller handed my phone back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice now cold and authoritative, "we're going to need to secure this area and collect some samples of that meat for analysis. This is now a police investigation." She turned to Officer Jenkins. "Call for forensics. We'll need to establish the identity of this animal beyond a doubt." Mrs. Henderson looked like she was about to faint. "You can't," she gasped, clutching at her chest. "My reputation. This is an outrage." But her words held no power now. The spell of her authority was broken. The HOA committee members who had been standing with her subtly began to back away, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and fear. Mr. Peterson, his face ashen, mumbled something about having to check on his rose bushes and tried to slip away unnoticed. Just then, Lily, emboldened by the presence of the police and the sudden shift in the crowd's mood, pointed at Mrs. Henderson. "You took Daisy," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "You hurt my Daisy." Her innocent accusation, echoing in the sudden silence, hit harder than any adult's words. Mrs. Henderson flinched as if struck. Officer Miller then turned to me, her gaze filled with a new seriousness. "Ma'am, we're going to need to take a full statement from you. And we'll need to secure your backyard as well, as a potential crime scene." My legs felt weak with relief, but also with a profound sadness. Justice was coming for Daisy, but it wouldn't bring her back. As the officers began to cordon off Mrs. Henderson's yard, a murmur went through the crowd. No longer whispers of disbelief, but of anger and disgust. People started openly condemning Mrs. Henderson, their voices rising in a unified chorus. How could she? That poor little goat. And to do it for a community barbecue. The woman who had ruled Sunnyside Estates with an iron fist, who who had obsessed over rules and appearances, was now exposed as a cruel, heartless monster. The very community she claimed to protect was turning on her. The scene was chaotic, a complete breakdown of the polite, orderly world Mrs. Henderson had so carefully constructed. I just stood there, clutching my children, watching as her meticulously planned barbecue, her final act of twisted control, collapsed into a swirling vortex of police tape, flashing lights, and the undeniable stench of a terrible, terrible crime. The wild ending I had hoped for was unfolding before my very eyes, a horrifying, yet undeniably triumphant, display of justice.